Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Atheist Uprising. I'm your host, Joshua Voigt, and tonight we're going to have a fantastic debate. The debate is based on the nature of consciousness, realism, or physicalism. Now, that's going to be a great discussion to have. But before we do that, let me just state thank you so much for everybody who's in the comments section at this very moment. I do appreciate you being here. And if you have any questions during the actual debate, please put them down inside the comments section, and I will actually bring them up in the last the last 20 minutes, which is based on Q&A questions. Next, before that, I just want to thank our Patreon supporters, Linear and T.A.R.T, for helping us do what we love doing, which is creating awesome content for you, the viewer. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our guests and debaters for tonight, starting with my guest host, Scott Williamson. Scott Williamson, how are you doing tonight?
Power triangles, baby. We're doing it, man. We're doing it, and we're stoked.
Damn right. And also, Agent. Agent, how are you doing? And welcome.
I'm Cody. I just thought that would look cooler.
Cody, how are you doing? All right. So what's going to happen, I'm going to move myself to the bottom. There we go. So what's going to happen is that Cody is going to be arguing based on the physicalistic perspective of consciousness, while Scott Williamson is going to be debating based on the realism aspect of consciousness. So I'm going to break down how the debate is going to go. There's going to be a 7-minute intro, 7-minute rebuttal, 40-minute back and forth. Then we're going to have a 20-minute Q&A. And then from there, we're going to have another 7 minutes ending statements. And then the debate will be over. So starting now, it's going to be Cody who's going to be first with the intro. Cody?
All right. Thank you, Josh. Thanks, Scott, for joining me today. This will be fun, guys. So I'm looking for how to explain physicalism and how that relates to consciousness. And I'm going to argue that, all our best forms of finding things out and collecting knowledge, all of our epistemology, points towards something that we can call physical, and it's just anything described by physics. And it's you would think it sounds like a form of reductionism, where you take something that's really complex and just break it down into smaller and smaller parts so you can understand it. But I don't agree that physics as a whole tells us that this is how reality is composed. I think that what we call physics is, I'm using both the words interchangeably, which isn't fair because you're the realist, but I just think that performing experiments and gathering data and using the statistical and mathematical and logical tools to figure out whatever it's saying is, the best way that we can characterize reality. It's like, the epistemology and the ontology, when it comes down to it in science, that's kind of the same thing. That's like functionalism in philosophy of science. I mean, I've got lots of examples about why this doesn't lead to reductionism. And, we find out that really what we call physical, what used to be materialism, you started calling it physicalism because you're like, well, physics is energy and fields. It's not just material. So that's kind of the updated materialism. But the more updated you get with it, the more it resembles the same thing that we call consciousness. They're just two different ways of looking at the same thing. You've got your primary source, your experiments. It's what the word empirical comes from. In empirical science, it means observed. So that's already included in the definition, right?
Are you done? You fin? Or
Well, it sounds like you're with me, so that's a good thing.
I'm with you. I'm definitely with you. I'm
Agree
just
on what empirical
Understand
science.
you. Yep.
These are first steps. It's foundational.
Mhm.
All right, and just some of these examples about physics being, a unified whole instead of all these little different parts. We use the parts to study it. We have to control for experiments and actually try to eliminate the observer as much as we can, to have this scientific impartiality, and sum it up over all of these trials, and you have to do all these, statistical analyses and find out if the data is, valid or significant. But no experiment can essentially remove the observer. It's, if you do a thought experiment, what experiment can you possibly perform that has any point at all that increases knowledge or tells you anything useful that no one will ever observe? Like there's not even a way to check the data to, infer something out of it that might be real. Like not even the least kind of information or interaction. That's the same as something that does not exist. It's the same definition. If you look online for dictionary definitions of existence, either it's circular and just uses different words to say that something exists, or they reference observation and something it can possibly be consciously observed. Is that 5 minutes?
That's perfect. Right on the mark. All right. Thank you very much, Scott. It is now your turn.
All right. Thank you so much for the conversation today. I'm really looking forward to it. Everyone here, Corey and Josh, and thanks for putting it together. I'll get right into it, and thank you so much for bringing out some of the finer points about physicalism versus materialism. Usually, I tend to look at the two as the same for the same reasons that you outlined, that physicalism is simply just adding more updated observations on top of it, but it's fundamentally the same. Physicalism is a philosophical point, it's metaphysics. So in philosophy, physicalism is the metaphysical thesis that everything is physical, that there is nothing over and above it, the physical, or that everything supervenes on the physical. And so physical is everything. So it's a metaphysical claim. And my point is this is not scientific, despite the intuition otherwise. Science is a physicalist or a materialist. It uses methodological physicalism or materialism in order to do things. So it will use a useful fiction as a way of speaking about things, but science is not in the business of saying what a thing is. It talks about what a thing does, behavior. It's not talking about what it is. When you're talking about what it is, we're talking about philosophy. And so the point that I'm coming to is conscious realism. So conscious realism is just a proposed answer to the question of what the universe is made of. So conscious realism would assert that the objective world, the world of existence, does not depend on the perceptions of a particular observer. It consists entirely of cognitive agents. So conscious realism is a non-physicalist monism, if you will. So conscious realism is the most parsimonious and it's the most internally consistent position. So it makes the simplest of assumptions. It needs the least amount of assumptions and bears the most inexpensive ontological cost, while physicalism assumes an entirely new metaphysical property that entails many other inferences to explain consciousness, for example, which is neither parsimonious nor is it evidence. That's why we have this thing called the hard problem of consciousness. It cannot get past that barrier. Physicalism postulates unnecessary assumptions. Mentality is the most primary and provides the most explanatory solutions. All these observations in science are done in consciousness, not outside of it. So physicalism fails to explain that. It doesn't explain mind, it doesn't explain consciousness in the category of the conceptual. All we have is experience. Yet physicalism actually uses the abstract and the conceptual in order to argue against the primary function of consciousness. It actually mistakes the descriptions for the thing itself. It confuses the map for the territory. So instead of, realizing and trying to update itself to the fact that space-time is not actually fundamental, it takes that particles, energy, matter, all these things are fundamental. Well, we kind of know that it's not. We kind of have different theories to kind of explain, like loop quantum gravity. You've got the many worlds theory, you've got string theory. So you've got all these things to kind of fill that gap, but yet these things, are theoretical. But one thing that they all have in common is they acknowledge that the material physical world is not fundamental. We can only measure to the Planck scale. We can't go beyond the Planck scale. That's when physicalism breaks down. Physics breaks down, the laws of physics break down. And our best theories tell us that space-time is doomed. There's actually so many books on this, it's ridiculous. Relativity and quantum mechanics tells us this, that reductionism falls apart at the Planck scale, which is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters. And at that scale, the laws of physics don't even hold up, and it's labeled as a singularity. Evolutionary game theory tells us that knowing the truth about the world leads to the extinction, whereas intuitions and our imagination leads to success of a species to survive in any given environment. For example, the Australian jewel beetle. We have evolutionary game theory that says knowing, more about the world will actually kill us. If we see that wind, if we see the bush rustling, it could be by the wind or it could be, a ghost behind it. Our ancestors thought they were ghosts, so we ran away, right? In doing that, taking advantage of that useful fiction kind of helped us spread our species, right? Even distance, when we see something coming along, we kind of automatically assume we got to get out of the way really earlier than we do. Because if you get out of the way earlier, you'll guarantee your survival, right? So those are one of the ways that evolution has actually helped us understand that our intuitions aren't necessarily real. So when we think about consciousness as this, physical property, it's very intuitive, but it's not necessarily real. What's more real is the primary thing, the consciousness that all these observations and thoughts and mathematics go along with. And
I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry.
No worries. Great. Now back at you, Cody. A 5-minute rebuttal based on what he stated. If you find anything which is a problem with his statement.
Okay, and wait, that was 10 minutes. So I thought.
Oh no, that was only like 5 minutes right there.
Okay, I'll go with it. So, yeah, what I heard about conscious realism. All right, let me get this straight. Is that it differs from physicalism as in that it doesn't take on the extra responsibilities of explanation. It kind of opts out of making an ontological claim about a methodological data, you know. And you know, that's parsimony in a way, but you can say that the most parsimonious position is not saying or claiming anything at all. You always have to weigh, you know, in Occam's razor, it's, you know, using the fewest assumptions, say the most that you can about reality in a way that's, you know, that can be pragmatic, you know, and that's what we define truth as. You know, it could be just a relative and functional pragmatic truth in the end. It just helps us survive and continue to have consciousness and increase the number of conscious agents. And, you know, this is kind of how evolution is headed, you know. But you can say that what we call reality is consciousness centered. You know, it doesn't happen when we're not trying to think of words and descriptions for it and depending on this conscious experience for our survival. It's like there's nothing to speak of. Everything else is that's observed is always in relation to that. You know, it's called you know, other than the observer, it's necessary for most of our calculations in physics. And it's an assumption that a lot of people take for granted, but it's called, you know, a reference point, or, you know, a frame of view. And it's just your, you know, wherever you draw the little origin zero at the center of your graph, you know, somebody has to make that choice. And unless you input these variables that we're just kind of like pulling out of our experience and building a story about it, you know, this is what all physics depends on. And so, I mean, there are some, you know, there's some intermediate calculations that, you know, it's pure math. They just say it works and it works, and, you know, who can say why, but everything else has this, you know, space-time relevance. It's always referencing what we're calling the physical. And that happens to be centered on a physical body in most cases, as far as I know. You know, we won't get into that now, you know, but but I think it can be a distributed body. You know, it's not necessarily all in one place at the same time. And that's where I wanted to bring up the quantum physics experiments that they handed out the Nobel Prizes for last year. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was pretty cool because I've kind of been reading about and watching this whole debate and all the new experiments, and it's like, okay, I feel vindicated, you know, but it's not even like I'm rooting for the underdogs. Maybe I'm being an establishmentarian, but no, they were underdogs to begin with, but now they're just kind of like ruling, and mm-hmm. nobody really questions them anymore. It's the mm-hmm. it's the freaking Copenhagen interpretation, you know. Mm-hmm. Everybody's mm-hmm. on board with it, even if they changed it to call it consistent histories, but that just clarifies it and makes it intuitive. So talk about that.
Perfect. Alrighty. So now Scott Williamson is passed on to you. 5 minutes for rebuttal.
Okay. So actually everything you said actually just sort of, it's kind of weird how certain things can support your view and maybe someone who has a different view can feel like that same information supports their view. So I can at least tell you how it supports, or how I think it supports my view. So what you're talking about is the experiments, the Bell's theorem, the non-local realism being debunked finally for the 100 zillionth time. I agree with that. And it's always been a little bit woo-woo to suggest what the non-local realism tends to imply.
Yes.
And
Quantum
so,
mysticism, Deepak.
right, because see, they're trying to say that, there is no local realism, that actually it's a non-local field of possibilities being distributed in reality. And so we've got all these different tests like the Bell's theorem to sort of prove that. But that goes into exactly what I'm trying to say, is that, what we think as real is simply a representation. Our minds have not evolved to know the truth about the situation. We know what works in order to help our species survive and procreate to a certain degree. And
Donald Hoffman.
yeah, Donald Hoffman is a perfect example of that. Bernardo Kastrup talks about this. This British physicist also endorses, I think, cubism and some other ideas like that. And so what we have is just more demonstration that what we intuitively think as real and fundamental, and we even build our science around it, is actually false. But it's a useful fiction. That's the difference. Evolution, Newtonian physics, relativity, all that stuff works. But we know that reality, we can actually talk about it in ciphers. Like we have quantum mechanics. We have we're at that level of reality. Of course, things work in different rules, totally different, totally non-intuitive than the way that we operate in this more Newtonian mechanical universe that we live in, that's more determined and more, this molecule bumps into this molecule and then it merges into this particular set. All of these type of things are true within that framework, right? But not necessarily at the fundamental level. So we already know that it's possible that how we perceive the world is wrong. And the way that I like to use it is kind of like in an airplane. You're in an airplane, you can't really maybe see, because you're covered in cloud cover or whatever, the darkness of the sky. But you have these instruments on your panel, and these knobs and instruments can kind of navigate you through the world, and they can take you to a soft landing or whatever you desire to do if you use your instrumentation right. So that's kind of what consciousness is for. It's kind of given us this interface where we can sort of navigate our world effectively. Does it mean that the world is a knob? Does it mean that the world has, these parameters that are written out into distinguishable language that we can read in order to use it effectively? No, of course not. That would be silly. That would defeat the whole purpose of having the interface to begin with, right? So this non-local realism prize supports all that. It just tells us more so that we can't really understand fundamental reality intuitively. So this is very interesting for me, and it gives me my idea about consciousness, because consciousness is in a different category than, say, physical behavior. Behavior is what things do, whereas consciousness is more about what things are from the inside. And so what's on the inside seems to project onto the outside. So our behaviors sort of reflect our conscious states and things of that nature. Anyways, I'm just in agreement with everything you've said. It tends to support my view, I think. And I'm kind of not sure where to go from here. So I'll just kind of leave it right there for now.
Sounds good. You had 10 seconds left, but fantastic. Okay, so now we're going to go into the open conversation at the moment. This is going to be 40 minutes. So whoever wants to start and commence the conversation, please.
Yeah. I think I get what you're saying, and I think the difficulty here in this conversation is finding the differences between what we're saying. So it's like you're coming at it from the first assumption, Rene Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am, and that's the primary data, no matter what, is just whatever this moment of consciousness contains. And and even more so, we can't even really identify what any moment of consciousness contains. It's like every attempt to identify it is really, you're sort of, when you're thinking, you're just talking to yourself.
Yeah, it's
having more experiences.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult, but I would say that first off, depending on how you define physicalism or materialism, I think that if we can both agree that physicalism is a philosophy that is not necessarily science, it's just a kind of a useful way of talking about behaviors. And so maybe we can agree at least on that.
It's metaphysics.
Yeah, it is metaphysics. And so what I'm trying to do is, as a skeptic, I am an atheist skeptic, pantheist. I kind of see nature as the explanation ultimately goes back to the nature of reality. I mean, it seems like a very no-brainer, but believe me, you'd be surprised to see how many people disagree with that. But the point is that everything we think about, like distance, space, time, all these things are products of our brain, right? They're not necessarily reflecting the truth, but we do know that consciousness exists. That's why we're sitting here talking about it. That's why we know we exist and we're conscious of that existence. So to think that only parts of the universe or some part of reality is conscious, whereas some of it is not, is kind of a metaphysical extrapolation of physicalism. So what we want to do, though, is kind of be a little more epistemically humble and say that maybe everything is non-local, that maybe everything is one thing. It's just that the human brain ciphers things out for usefulness, that it's kind of a useful fiction to say, well, him over there, he's thinking of this and that. I don't have access to that. So that means he's a different person than me, or a different conscious entity than me. On one level, that's obviously true, right? That's obviously true. We're thinking in the Newtonian mechanical way of thinking. But if quantum mechanics is true, at least if some of these interpretations are true, you could say that it's non-local, that everything exists as one time, one place, one thing. You don't need a God for that. Obviously, it sounds very atheistic what I'm saying, but it's just to say that consciousness may not be what we think it is. And maybe it's not the only form of consciousness, if we want to call it that. Like I tend to think that cognitive work happens throughout the universe at very small levels. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with Michael Levine, but he's a biologist, kind of an atheist biologist or whatever, but he sort of sees cognition even within one-celled systems, and that even DNA, things like that, don't actually carry the information as we once thought, but that there's something above the DNA that actually carries the things that form, and it makes decisions. It decides what should be lost, what information should be, so there's a form of cognition that goes on, a very fundamental level of biology. And so this is kind of what I'm arguing for, is that maybe we're not as special as we like to think,
Well, that definitely does address what people usually think about when they think of physicalism, but I might argue that that's a straw man, because you can't really be talking about all the people who call themselves physicists and call themselves physicalists, because there are, there's a bunch of suppositions. Everybody's got their own take on what that means.
Yeah, and I don't want to do that. Like I'm just picking out, like when I was coming up with this opening, I was just grabbing the definition off encyclopedias and stuff, and that's not really a good way to frame a person's definition or another person's viewpoint, obviously. But I thought it was at least a good place to start, so where maybe you could say, no, when I say physicalism, I actually mean this instead of that. So, but yeah, you're right. It's very easy to strawman. We get this all the time. Like, I think today somebody was called a solipsist who was not arguing for solipsism, but
he thought he was right.
Yeah, he thought he was right.
Somebody who thinks they're right.
Yeah, it's like if you have a belief, you're a solipsist. And that was the charge levied against the atheists. But in fact, if that's true, if it's based on beliefs, then it could be the same thing against the theists, that they're also solipsists, right? Maybe so there's a lot of problems with
presuppositionalist. That's his word for atheist. Presuppositionalist is a solipsist. It only applies to atheists.
That's right. That's right. That's unfortunately the case. But yeah, I mean, we need to find out where we kind of disagree, because I do see that, science works. It non-local realism, I agree. I'm on board with you 100% on that. I'm just trying to figure out, would you say, maybe I could ask you a question. How do you resolve the hard problem of consciousness under physicalism, or your version of it?
Right. And it's sort of like, what I'm saying is, what hard problem? So it's like, I'm coming at it like consciousness sort of resolves its own question of itself in a way. It is what it is, but that's where you start. And then we aspire to knowledge and epistemology to say anything else about it. And it might be pragmatic only, and it might be beneficial, but even in your references of, the theory, Hoffman's theory, that an accurate conscious representation isn't always helpful, and sometimes works against survival in the world. And even as you said that, I was thinking, like, you're assuming the physical world even in your conscious explanation, even in your, and it's just always in our minds, all the contents of experience,
it's hard to shake it. I understand. It's like the problem is too that we compartmentalize everything. So whereas we can talk about the physical world, and yet somebody can say, well, I'm more of a conscious realist person. I don't think the physical world exists in the way that we see it, yet we're always going back to it to prove our points, right? So it's kind of self-refuting in a way. I see that. The difference is that where I give Hoffman credit is he's using mathematics. He told, like in the preface, he's always understanding it's so easy to say, it looks like I'm undercutting my own ideas by saying that there is no real world out there as we see it. And then at the same time, trying to use that to bolster my point really kind of goes in a circle. But what he's saying is that
on himself, he's saying this is what's real. And if you don't
this is what's real, how do you know that? Right. How would you know that if you are trapped in this?
He's making it more real.
Yeah, like how are you going to get out of that? And I think that what he's trying to do is he's appealing to mathematics. So mathematics is a tool we've used to sort of overcome our limitations of our mind. So like quantum mechanics, all this stuff, relativity started out as mathematical concepts. And a lot of people say, well, all this stuff is very unintuitive. It doesn't even make sense. Like when Einstein talked about, time bends and stuff like that. Like, all the physicists and philosophers were like, well, this is a contradiction in terms because we all agree what time is. Time is kind of like a concept of passing events. That's not a physical thing. So to say that it could bend is like a self-refutation. Like they didn't understand what he was talking about. Even in his equation, yeah, your equations might come out great, but that doesn't mean that it's real. It's just that's the limitation of your mathematics. But then they did experiments, and now we use GPS to, navigate us through the world, and all this stuff kind of relies on
Einstein
time being, you know what I mean? Like
broke reality. You
it's
have two different measurements at
mm-hmm.
two different places, and you can use inference to say that they happened at the same time. But what is that? The same concept of the same time is broken now. The instruments we use for reality to measure reality, they said it's not a thing.
Right. And so mathematics seems to be working for us. So if we're going to make an attempt at trying to understand, I mean, otherwise we might as well throw the whole scientific project out the window. So we have to use something. We have to build on what we know. And it seems like even with evolution, not very intuitive. We're talking about deep time. We're talking about things that don't come easy for us to understand. We're talking about how things adapt and change and why, and all these things don't seem, but there's evidence in the form of predictions. We can make predictions. We can observe these predictions as real. Therefore, that counts as good evidence towards something. So, and I understand that even all that is based on philosophy. Even that's based on the idea that there's this outside world that we can measure and that we can at least gain, but it's worked. It's got us technology. It's got us medical innovations, things like that. And I'm just saying, if we're going to go with that, if we're going to try to work with that, then we kind of have to, kind of understand what they're saying here. They're not saying physicalism at this point is science. It's just a way of speaking about it. And we have to take them serious at that because the scientists, they're not actually doing that. Unfortunately, I've heard a lot of scientists say that they are physicalists or they are idealists or they are these philosophical positions. I mean, I guess they could do that as long as it doesn't interfere with what goes on in the lab. I mean, at the end of the day, science is just measuring behavior. But as long as we can kind of understand that, then we can sort of hash over the philosophical implications, I guess.
I mean, you got mathematics and science with, a 0% failure rate when it's used right. You can trace it back and see exactly why. You're not going to expect a different result ever.
Right. And the mathematics, what do they say? The latest mathematics are telling us that space-time, energy, matter is not fundamental, that these things sort of emerge from more fundamental properties or something like the amplituhedron, model, or these string theories, or, this, what is it? The holographic principle, where reality is really like this information state, and that from that emerges, but you still need consciousness to decode all that stuff, So that's where the realism of consciousness comes in,
Yeah, and I don't know. I think I had a couple of. I have one thing to say about you're saying that consciousness is real, and you're defining realism as something that's there when nobody's looking at it. It just sounds a little self-contradictory if I put it that way.
Well, yeah, it's self-referential, obviously. I couldn't prove to you or anyone else that I was a conscious person, right? It would definitely be something hard for me to. The only way I could prove it is through behavior. But even behavior, I could be a P zombie or just a really fancy AI robot that all this stuff is going on in the dark. I mean, that much is true. But I guess it's just a matter of if we can agree that consciousness is a thing, that you feel you're conscious, and you can sort of extrapolate or infer that other people are conscious. You're not a solipsist. If you can get past that, because actually that is the most parsimonious view, the solipsism. But if we can understand that solipsism isn't very useful and it's kind of irrational in a way because the way we behave is as if other people are conscious. We have this theory of mind going, hopefully.
Definitely, it's the foundation of everything else we think we know, because we form our psychological schemas from this socialization with other people, and our language base. We're always motivated, uh, hopefully, by our connection to other people, from a very young age. And it's like just baked into the cognition, you know and then later comes the physical
Hmm.
manipulation, the object permanence. And
Yes.
that mental development starts to include wider and wider parts of what we
Hmm.
call the physical world. It's like, um and so I say that conscious realism is a contradiction in terms, but that's only if you don't take this principle and follow it through to its conclusion, and call, you know, not you the real world. What you say is real in realism. The objective world that exists when we're not looking at it. You
Hmm.
know, that's actually most accurately called intersubjective,
Hmm.
because you know all we have is
Hmm.
the primary data is our own subjective experiences, and the more and more other subjective experiences, you know, hypothesized, where it seems that way, and so we're treating it that way.
Hmm.
Um, but the more we do that, the more accurate our measurements become. If we apply the logic that we build it from experiences, and eventually learn that, oh, people have been doing this through you know since ancient times, and they've gotten better at it, at noticing the logical patterns, things that they could predict versus things that they couldn't. And the skills and tools used to predict it, you know that comes from sharing our experiences and communicating it and collaborating to build these sciences and methods
Yeah.
to check it.
And it's all abstractions. It's all abstractions. Like even the Higgs boson, you might think, well, they found the Higgs boson? What do they mean? They found an actual little tiny little piece of property that they call the Higgs boson that does this thing and that thing. No, actually, what they found was, when they put it through this, large hadron collider, and the particle decays, there's certain things that happen that sort of imply that this Higgs boson is the cause of it, and it's all an abstraction. It's not that it isn't real. I totally understand that it's real and objective. That's part of being a realism. It's real in that sense, just like evolution is real. But at the lower levels, these things aren't necessarily what we think they are. That there's something totally alien, something we wouldn't really recognize. Even the brain, you start talking about, well, the brain causes consciousness, right? Well, even when we look at the brain, we're looking at the brain, the neurons, all of these things are abstractions. They're just things that correlate with certain experiences and things like that. And any logic would tell you that, correlation isn't necessarily causation, that, these things are just abstractions. Again, it's a way of speaking about things. Yeah, they're correlated, they're useful. And the more we draw these correlations, we can come up with drugs that work for depression. We know that drinking alcohol can affect our conscious experience. All of these things hold true under the view of conscious realism. All of that still works. It's just that what we're trying to say, or what conscious realism is trying to say, is that there really are an objective world out there, and there really is a consciousness that is fundamental to decoding all of that stuff. Materialism, on the other hand, seems to say what they think idealism says, that there is no real world out there in a way, because what they're trying to say is that when you look at the color red, or you look at, a car or whatever it is, your object you're looking at, you're not really looking at anything. It's just your brain is deconstructing some stuff, and that's really what's going on. So it's kind of the other way around. What we're saying is that there's actually an objective world out there. It may not be what we think it is, but it is out there, So those are the differences I see. What sort of contradictions would you say, other contradictions would you say holds with conscious realism? Sorry.
Right. I mean, I guess I was just returning the favor of straw manning you, because you didn't mention the world by mistake, but you referenced it more as an unknown variable, and second to the conscious content. It's not a denial of the objective world, but it is still an assumption. And if I had to argue something different, I would say that that's almost like a dualism in itself. And it's like, if you're saying it's the most parsimonious, I don't know if you can use the assumption of dualism to explain what it means. That's kind of like having your cake and eating it too.
Under conscious realism, I think everything has at least one assumption. Anytime, even in science, anytime you do science, you need at least one assumption, or as Don Hoffman likes to say, you need at least one miracle. After that, we can explain everything else. Just give us that one thing. And miracle is simply that thing that we can't explain, right? And once it gets explained, then it no longer becomes a miracle. But under this view, yeah, I agree. There's an assumption there, just like with anything else. I'm arguing for parsimony as the reason why. And what's parsimonious about it is that I'm not including any alien or special metaphysics in it. I'm simply going by what we primarily know first and foremost, which is our conscious experience, and the fact that we are affected by an outside world, outside minds, outside objects. If we didn't think that, we'd constantly be bumping into stuff all the time. So we have to take those things serious, but they're not necessarily maybe what we think they are. They're more like representations that the mind gives us. And I don't think that part of it is that controversial. I think that most evolutionary psychology would say that we didn't evolve to know what it's like if you throw a orange beer bottle out in the outback in Australia, a jewel beetle will jump on it and try to mate with it because it sees little dimples, it sees the little tan color, and it automatically assumes this is my mate.
Giant beetle.
that doesn't mean that the beer bottle is actually another jewel beetle. It just means that something about it triggered its consciousness to react to it. And it wouldn't be wrong, because that behavior actually helped it survive millions of years as a jewel beetle, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same thing that's going on here. I don't think any of that's controversial. I think maybe what's going a little more controversial for us is that what I'm trying to say is a little deeper than that. I'm trying to say that ontologically, that there's this fundamental conscious, entities or conscious things that are fundamental, like they're the fundamental thing rather than the particles that we observe. That, you know what I mean? And that's where I think I would get in trouble with a lot of, physicalists or even a lot of scientists, because there's no evidence to support it right now. It's
a prioritizing of the same thing maybe that an honest physicalist might say. I mean, you say consciousness is what we call existing, and so is the something else we call the physical world, but we only know what's ontologically conscious, and everything else, if you can't say anything about it, I guess you kind of take a step further and say that it's all one thing. But
yeah, like a monism,
different from consciousness because it's less direct. It's only inferred.
The one fact that we maybe can agree on is that we can't step out of our skull. And, when we see the night sky, we see the stars, this stuff is taking place in the darkness of our skulls, right? It's not like we're out there looking at it and actually, we're not in that special position to know the thing, intimately, to know exactly what it is. All we can do is see what's represented by our brain and our sense organs and things of that nature. And so we're kind of trapped. We're sort of stuck in this mind, right? And so everything that we're saying are truth, everything that we're saying are lies, everything that all kinds of, pronouncements, all of this stuff is done in consciousness. Even the observations, even the science is done inside a conscious head. And the best we can do is we have these other conscious agents with us that we can kind of bounce off and kind of verify this information. So we have this category called the objective. And so I think the best we can do is the scientific method, which is to objectively do tests, do predictions, and then verify it among our peers and come to some sort of conclusion, which is tentative for those very same reasons, So it's a tricky one. And a lot of people don't like the idea of anything that sounds similar to idealism or anything like that, because it has such baggage with it. It's sort of looked at as anti-science, because science, the philosophy of science is to assume that the outside world is the way we see it. That way we can be confident when we make measurements and it works. But I think that's a little misleading, and I think even scientists today would agree.
You can remove the bias, but not completely, and thinking that you can completely remove the bias is itself a bias.
Yep. Very well said. Very well said. Yeah, that's one reason that I strive hard to be a cognitive skeptic and an agnostic about most things. I don't really try to have many presuppositions or assumptions. It's like you said before, I kind of base my epistemology on two things. First of all, my epistemology is based on I exist. I'm conscious of an existence. That much I can know. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here having this conversation. And the other thing is to make the least amount of assumptions about anything, any belief or anything like that I can possibly. The less assumptions, the more parsimonious it is. And I think that's the more reasonable thing to do, because when you're assuming more, you're just opening up that possibility to be wrong. You know, you're adding stuff in there you're not even sure about. You're just adding a lot of beliefs upon beliefs upon beliefs. And at the end of the day, you may just have a whole mountain of beliefs that are unfounded. And whereas if I can just make as least amount of those as possible, then I can at least think that my statements are going to be in line with what's factual or what I can demonstrate. You know, that's the whole point.
So you would rather not be wrong than be able to talk about greater number of things confidently.
Oh no, well, maybe I misstated. I can be wrong and I can do hypotheses, as long as I admit that they're hypotheses. Like this thing here, right now, this whole idea of conscious realism. It's just a hypothesis. It's just an imaginary idea. It's just imagination. Just like materialism, physicalism, whatever, they're just metaphysics. They're just ideas that we use to talk about things. But they don't really necessarily map onto the real world, you know?
Yeah, that's more like the freedom to be wrong.
Yeah, right. And you want to have that freedom. Otherwise, we don't learn anything. Like, I don't think many of the scientists and philosophers in the world would have gained much traction if they didn't go out on a limb to maybe be wrong. You know, they had to take a risk and risk their assumptions as wrong. You know, and I think that's okay, so long as you admit what you're doing. As long as you admit what you're doing, like I would. And this is why I'm not religious. Like I would never say, yeah, conscious realism is the truth, and that's just the way it is. And then I can't really demonstrate that 100%. I can only give you arguments and give you an explanation, maybe challenge it against physicalism, and vice versa. I've argued for physicalism against things like dualism and, you know, theism and things like that as well. I've done that a lot, whole lot. But at the beginning of my, you know, debates, I always say, look, I'm not making a truth claim. I'm just making an argument for something. And which side wins will depend on which argument seems more consistent, more parsimonious. But it doesn't mean that it's true. Something could be logically explained. It could explain everything perfectly, like God explains things perfectly. If you think about it, which means it explains nothing. Because you know, you can make anything up. You know, it's what can we demonstrate? That's the point.
Yeah, well, you're allowing for your logic, and that allows for all the other knowledge. You know, and that's you're proving that it's useful, and you have all this technology, and you know, you get to be proven right if you make a prediction and just say, ah ha ha ha, I knew it, you didn't.
Ego.
But then, yeah, it's also like the more you know, the more you figure out you don't know. You know, and it's this metaphysics is, you know, yes, physicalism, you know, is a philosophical stance rather than a scientific one. You know, but I think part of it is it comes down to perspective and what you're trying to say with it, you know, what you're responding to, and the context of, you know, whatever you're going to define physicalism as. But, you know, at the same time, in philosophy and metaphysics, it's a little bit like mathematics, because you're supposed to be able to demonstrate your reasoning using logic and support your statements and make an argument just the same as in math and science, you know. um, maybe it's not able to make predictions in the same way, but it can guide people towards more accurate models, and they can use that to make predictions in scientific study.
Oh, well, materialism and physicalism works. There's no doubt about that. I love it because all of those predictions were, they use the tool of methodological materialism in order to understand the behavior and make predictions. Well, if if this thing combines with this thing, it will do this, supposedly, hypothetically. And if it does, well, then you've garnered some evidence about the physical world. That's a great thing. That's a great tool, and it's worked for us, and it's gotten us a lot farther than idealism has, or anything like religion. So I'm all for that. But every paradigm, it seems that we have a track record in history of paradigms actually, if not being overthrown, at least more succinct, more described more rigorously, like our understandings of gravity, light, all of this kind of stuff, the shape of the world, everything, all of these things, how the biodiversity of life. To get to where we are today took a lot of paradigm shifts of our understanding, and where we had to say that, what we thought was just solid foundational truth is actually not that way, And so that's what I guess I kind of mean with epistemic humility. And it's real easy in situations like that to just, why is it important? Like, if this is working for us, why would we have to, figure out if consciousness or whether time is
3 minutes.
physical, like, why would we have to do all that? Whatever we've got now seems to work, whatever. But look what we've accomplished by digging in.
Well, it's starting to fall apart a little bit. It's so much knowledge. It's kind of starting to turn back and erase itself. It's like, the anti-realism and postmodernism and all that is, that's a result of physicalism, and a result of realism is we're learning that consciousness is itself an illusion. What we think we see and what we describe seeing, and what we retroactively think back 2 seconds in the past that we're seeing is itself. We're breaking it into smaller and smaller pieces the more we examine it, neurology and psychology, and and
Yep.
and even the adaptive erroneous perception, and so it's like, if you want to defend conscious realism, you're almost going to have a time. It'll be difficult to define consciousness, because the more you try to pick it apart in a way that's not just self-referential, you can only really say it is what it is, unless you're trying to get a certain response from somebody, to get something for some future anticipated reward in some way. And that in itself, that's just a feeling, it's imaginary, the future and whatever you're thinking about it. And
So true, man.
that's illusionism. It's a kind of reductionist materialism, but to the point that it's eliminative materialism. It says only materialism exists, and no real consciousness, but only the impression of consciousness, which is that sounds a little bit self-contradictory to me, but it's like,
because who is being diluted? Like, who is the subject that's being? I mean, that's the whole thing. Conscious
yeah,
subject.
what is an
conscious-
impression other than consciousness? How can you
Right.
have?
We are good. That was a good conversation. Good
We
conversation.
could go on forever, man.
I know, right? But now
No
it's
pressure.
time for the Q&A.
Cool.
So at this very moment, I see one right over. Oh, I just had it. Right over here. What do you think of structural realism? This is by Dan Breeden.
Structural realism. So, I would say that they appear in consciousness. Structural realism. I guess it's sort of the same as physicalism in the sense that encompass matter, energy, physical laws, space-time structure, processes, information states. On one level, yeah, of course, we can observe all that. We can observe it. Fundamentally, though, they're not the structures themselves. We can only measure those structures down to the Planck scales. After that, it becomes disorganized and sort of incoherent. We can't really measure stuff like that. And this is why physicists have sort of gone into suggesting that there's something more fundamental than space-time itself, that we have antipohedron, is a model that may account for the emergence of space-time, things of that nature. We have holographic principles. We have all these principles and things that are based on real scientific observations in themselves, at least the mathematics. And so it's just like anything else in the Newtonian world that I experience. Yeah, it works. It's true. It works in that sense. Fundamentally, I don't think so.
And Cody, what do you think? What do you think of structural realism?
Yeah, I think you're kind of holding back a little bit to say that, if you include everything in the picture of what you're saying and don't say anything more about it, you're sticking to the idea that you don't have a basis to tell apart epistemology and ontology, but you're admitting that the epistemology is as real as it gets. So you're setting your bar of real and
low, yeah.
knowledge, and just calling it that. But
that's right.
I really think that that's what our best science tells us is the case, is that, you have a measurement and it's always, you don't necessarily know what's going on, but it always seems like one little thing is hitting another little thing, or one thing is having an effect that's propagated through space-time as energy and vibrations and having an effect on something else. And so everything that we can possibly describe is just these interactions, on a quantum level. And when something is not interacting, there's no way to describe it. And ultimately, we're following this hypothetical chain of events back to an observer who's then producing these mental models in the brain, in the subcortical cortical axis with the claustrum and the thalamus and the cerebral cortex. So that's almost like condensing the interactions that we think are happening beforehand, before it happens to the observer. In the brain, you have so many more of these hypothetical interactions. It's like, okay, if this particle can be considered real and this interaction is even more real than this particle, then that almost uses its own assumptions to say that if anything is real, then consciousness is actually more real, even if you assume that it's physical, because you've got billions and billions of neurons and throwing particles in every direction and all these combinations. And so what quantum physics says you're measuring, which is, it's non-local, it can involve more than one thing at a time, and in fact it has to involve more than one thing at a time,
and it's a probability distribution.
Yeah, it's you can't tell what the property of the particle is until it hits the detector, and you can't even infer what it is. Like,
bingo,
it's as if it wasn't even there in one way or another, which I was struggling to understand exactly how the experiment proved that, but that's just like, they checked it. It's mathematically valid, and
it's valid. It's just like you were saying earlier about the non-local Nobel Prize. It's like, let's say a lady named Alice represents a change made on particle A, let's say. Then you've got Bob, who makes a change on a measurement on particle B. Well, even if they're separated with one person across the whole other side of the universe, if Alice makes some sort of observation on particle A, it's automatically going to define what particle B is ontologically. So now we're looking at consciousness. We're looking at a facet of consciousness, at least measurement and observation, as superimposing itself on what is. And so that's another thing about my view.
I'm going to throw out another question from Titan. Wait, and I think this is for you, Scott. Wait,
Okay.
did I just twig? He thinks the tree doesn't make a sound if nobody's there to hear when it falls. So I think it's based on your position, based on being a realist.
Yes, is the moon there when we're not looking?
Yeah, it's there. The sound happens, the molecules move. And that's what sound is. It's just that there is no conscious observer to hear it. So whereas hearing, which I guess is implied in sound, but really sound is the movement of molecules in the air. And so there's something to be heard in the case that someone was there to hear it. But yeah, that's how I would answer that, I guess.
And Cody, what would you say based on that?
If you believe in God, you could say God heard it.
Yep. True. There's some observer.
Maybe that's why anything exists at all, according to quantum mechanics. Someone is watching
quantum mind.
They're just not watching that particular particle in that particular experiment. I think that's what it is.
Interesting. Okay. This is another one from Titan. Or that the fact that there is an objective reality, even without a brain-dependent mind, implies non-brain-dependent mind.
Okay, so let me dissect that.
Define brain.
Or that the fact there's an objective reality, even without a brain-dependent mind, implies a non-brain dependent mind.
Titan, if you can make that a little more simplified, that would be great in order for us to answer that question. All right, now we have another one from Titan, which is this just the cave, Plato, or brain perceives only part of the reality? Is that what he was referencing EP for? That we evolved to perceive no more because that's sufficient. So this is for you, Scott Williamson.
That case, I would stand by that one. I would say that we perceive reality through a conscious interface. we don't see things as they really are, but we see enough to get us through and survive, procreate, all that good stuff.
Okay, perfect. And Cody, what do you think about this question as well? I'm passing it to you.
Yeah, well, this reminds me of Aristotle, and it's what he thought of in response to this. I think it was, and it was picked up again by Thomas Aquinas. So it's Aristotelian Thomistic hylomorphism, and so that's just saying that, you know, there's a form and a substance, you know, to everything we can identify. You know, he was disagreeing with Platonism, saying that there could be forms without any embodiment; they just exist on their own. You know, he's saying that everything needs to have a substance, but you know, he didn't even include consciousness in this, you know, primary dualism. It was just kind of assumed, like, form is whatever the physical form really is in reality, plus all the impressions that it makes in the observers. And he doesn't go to say that they're two different things. It's all part of the same form. You couldn't have the impression in the minds of the observers without logically assuming a substance, an object that's really there. And you can't, you know, you can't assume the object without including all the impressions we have of it. And you know, people have put out lots of different forms of this, and you know, some people say it's not even a dualism. It's kind of a dual aspect monism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, because dualism is even a construct.
Right. Now we got another one from Titan that states, I still can't figure out if this is pantheism or some form of dualism. I believe this is to you as well, Scott, and maybe also to you as well, Cody. But whoever wants to take this question first, and then after I'll jump to the other person.
Yeah, so just to be clear, pantheism in the context of a God question makes sense. Like, it's just to say that all the things that a God can explain, nature can explain as well. So it's kind of like a parody on God or a refutation, at least in the way that I understand naturalistic pantheism. But if I was to say like some sort of ontological pantheist claim, I could defer to what Cody's talking about, you know, the non-local realism and the quantum mechanics, and say that, well, in fact, there is no these ideas that we have about separations and, you know, causations. Those things don't mean the same thing at that level. They don't really mean anything, you know, to talk about this thing causes that thing, this thing separated from that thing. At least from what I understand about quantum mechanics, is it doesn't take in consideration these same sort of classical concepts that we apply in, say, regular mechanics to quantum mechanics, because we're talking about a whole other realm of reality. So on that level, I would say that maybe ontological pantheism could be argued for, in the sense that everything's one thing, you know, but not necessarily. I think dualism would probably make more sense on a classical Newtonian backdrop. Maybe, I don't know.
Okay, and
because then because you know, you have what is it, substance dualism. I think there's a lot of I think that's kind of the cognitive neuroscience sort of, you know, favors that view more. Like, you know, it's kind of like a train, you know, that creates steam out of it when it's running, when you're burning all this water or coal or whatever it is. So it creates all this smoke. So the smoke is like the consciousness that comes off the process of the brain. So that's kind of like a dualistic sort of thing going on. Whereas I guess with a more pantheistic view, it'd be like everything's just one. It's not no separation. It's just that is what consciousness is. Consciousness is the brain processing itself, and vice versa. So it kind of has a upward and downward causation, whereas epiphenomenalism would only say that it's kind of like the shadow that your hand will cast. It's the hand that's really doing the shadow. The shadow doesn't have any sort of power. But from what we understand with consciousness, I can raise my hand. So obviously I'm having consciousness have some sort of physical causation,
All right, Cody.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's consciousness is doing something by the very fact of it being present, rather than a total black box philosophical zombie. It's impossible to do it. If non-dualism is true, then you couldn't have a philosophical zombie, because it would change, that acts exactly like a human being would, except it's not conscious, because that would probably change how they act. It's like, you could use maybe, you know, retroactively losing your memory, like in a blackout or something. It's like you think you weren't conscious because you don't remember being conscious, but who can really say? But you do act different. It's like, and you could say it's a lot of these higher brain centers involved that are causing this cross chat between the lesser brain centers and the speech centers and the visual centers, and you're having verbal thoughts, and it's all this. Thinking is really just sensory information that's already came in from the outside world. The energy from calories came from the sunlight, that powers our brain to see light. So it's as if it's something real, and it is something real anatomically, but
yeah. And another thing worth mentioning on this topic is there's a tendency to have this biological chauvinism. So we have this bias towards biological brains that is the only way that consciousness can ever be caused, right? But that's sort of an assumption, and it definitely flies in the face of like artificial intelligence, if we were ever to have conscious artificial intelligence, but also flies in the face of cognitive decision making at the level of one cell creatures that do that sort of interaction and decision making, which is a hallmark of some sort of feature of consciousness. I don't know if you want to call it executive consciousness or unconscious intelligence, or however you want to say it. It's all sort of, for me, I kind of put it all in the same bucket, like a cognitive bucket, where you have all these modes that it acts in. I don't think executive consciousness, like the way we think of it, is the only way that it happens. I think that that's just a little short-sighted and tends to make it look like humans are the epitome of conscious life in the universe. I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Interesting. We got another one, but this is more of a statement. And I guess this was talking about the change between particles and waves with that
superposition. Yeah.
Exactly. That's the observer fallacy. The of quantum mechanics. Observer just means that which interacts with, not some kind of conscious interaction. So I guess he was just trying to.
That's a good point. It seems like there's never going to be a conscious observation unless you shine light on it anyways. So
right.
I don't know what that necessarily might prove, but you want to give a shot at it, Cody?
I mean, I've heard this objection before, as you're debunking the
observer effect,
quantum
yeah.
woo, the mystical aspect, by
Mhm.
saying that, okay, the wave function really collapses as soon as it hits, it is as soon as it interacts with anything else,
Mhm.
any other particle at all. And
Mhm.
that's kind of part of what I was saying, at least, is that yeah, the the wave function might be indeterminate. Local realism might not be true until it interacts with something else, but that doesn't automatically jump forward to saying that there must be a conscious observer present
Mhm.
to make that wave function collapse. So it's like, they did a study. Does consciousness cause collapse? And I was disappointed because the study didn't work. He says, no, all it has to do is hit a detector. It doesn't matter if, one person is watching it and another person waits till longer. It doesn't matter at the level that he tested it. It's not a total disproof, but
It's evidence. It's evidence against certain, I guess, philosophical views on that. Whereas you need, this bold statement that you need a conscious mind to observe something with your eyes or whatever,
Right.
which
7
just,
seconds.
yeah, has a lot of problems because you got to shine photons onto that thing in order to observe anything. Even if you didn't use as least amount of equipment as possible, you still got
Well,
to shine a light on
who
it.
chooses to shine the light on it?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, no, the experiment is not about the observer, but we haven't refuted the observer either,
Right.
because the
Cubism.
rate
Yeah.
the rate of consciousness involved with every any experiment, any devised, is 100%.
Mhm.
So it's like, you've got consistent histories, which is saying that, okay, the wave function actually never collapses. It only collapses relative to two different quantum systems. And one of those quantum systems always includes an observer. And as soon as the observation happens, that physically means they become part of the same quantum system now. That's what observation is a conscious observer coming into contact with something in a way that produces some information about whatever else it was that maybe the conscious observer didn't know. It's the quantum system combines one interaction at a time. It gets bigger, and this happens at the speed of light, outward in all directions. And entanglement means, I guess, it could happen faster, right? I'm not sure.
Mhm.
Perfect. We are done with the Q&A. Thank you, everybody in the comment section, for sending out those questions. Thank you. Now, it is time for us to have our final statement. So I will begin with Scott Williamson, and then after it'll go to Cody and Mia. All righty.
Okay. All right. So I guess at this point, I'd like to talk about the support of the view as a closing statement. I kind of defined what it was. Conscious realism is the proposed answer to what the universe is made of, which is conscious agents observing a real world out there. What sort of scientific support do I have? Well, I'm taking the realist view. So this is legitimate as it is the foundation of scientific investigation. So if we can agree that science works and that it's the tool we want to use, then I shouldn't have to go and explain why I'm using that particular tool. It can be true that the next experiment will prove all of us wrong. And this is the good thing since we'd be learning something anyways. But number one, physicalism has been successful as it's given us technology, medical advances, as I said, but it fails to account for conscious experience so far in total. The reason is that science is objective by nature and consciousness is subjective by nature. So we've got a problem already. Our best theories tell us that space-time is doomed, relativity and quantum mechanics. Reductionism falls apart at the Planck scale, which is 10 to the minus 33 centimeters at that scale, and the laws of physics don't hold up, and we label this simply as a singularity because we don't know what else to call it. Evolutionary game theory also tells us that knowing the truth about our world leads to our extinction, whereas intuitions and our imagination leads to the success of our species to survive in any given environment. And I listed the Australian jewel beetle evolutionary game theory itself as a example. And then space, time, and gravity; those things are emergent rather than fundamental. So non-local realism supports this view that space, time, and gravity are emergent properties. That means that matter and energy is not fundamental. So we can't really rely on that brains as being the fundamental thing to consciousness. Cognitive neuroscience tells us that perception of reality is not as an accurate description of the world, like solidity, colors, thoughts about the self, the external world, on and on. The brain has constraints on how robust we can perceive ourselves and the world, and the mind only reconstructs reality. So what can I say here? We can classify consciousness as something other than behavior. Science only looks at behavior. We're going to have to look at consciousness as maybe another kind of science, or at least refine our current science on the brain and the mind in order to truly understand it. So far, it's been kind of stagnant. Behaviors are not the internal reality of what it's like to be something like a brain or some other experiencer. So I'll just kind of leave it there. And again, I'm not making a truth claim. This is just an argument against the opposing view, the best I can make it. And anyways, that's it.
Thank you. All right. Also notice you, Cody, and you got 7 minutes too, but if you want to cut it down to any other point, just like Scott did, it is perfectly fine.
Well, thank you, Josh. Scott, good closing. I think I would have to say about physicalism is, yes, it works, but even as a metaphysics, it's, it says a lot about the world that we live in, in a way that is consistent, especially at a certain scale within limits, and intuitively it really comes together. When you study the consciousness as part of the brain, there's some pretty good reasons to think that there's these electrical signals causing the conscious impressions and the contents of our experience. And so you can observe these correlations between these moments of consciousness and what we can logically and cognitively deduce from them. And you use these methods of science and apply them, and you get knowledge. But aside from that, it's really the correlations are the whole content of consciousness. So you have this quantum theory that says that all the material things are really just groupings of correlations and these interactions, at the finest level. And for your cognition and your vision and hearing and language, it's all about pattern recognition. It's about finding out these correlations and reconstructing the correlations that we hypothesize must be out there as physical reality. We're trying to align our behavior to match up with this outside reality, and that's our mental theories and our perceptions and all the different experiences we have are thinking. And that's not really different from what science is describing. It's just another form of it, or it's like a flip side of the coin. But that's what makes experience act the way it does, feel the way it does, is these scientifically proven correlations in the outside world. It's just two types. It's things that we feel in our body and things that we feel and sense in the outside world. And there's really no other consciousness to speak of other than consciousness of something that we deduce is physical. There's no real non-physical reality if we assume the first thing. The experience itself you don't have to assume, but to get anywhere else you have to start assuming things. And physicalism, you could say, is the first thing that you assume, but it's really the content of what you don't assume is the act of making the assumptions, right? From a young age, you assume, oh, I gotta, cry to get fed or something. You assume, okay, I can show attachment to somebody and be safe and feel better. And that really is the full content of consciousness, is these expectations that are slowly altered by learning and more observation, and these methods and the act of gathering knowledge, either intuitively or scientifically, is we self-talk, using language, using mental images about what we think we saw or heard. And did we really see anything 5 seconds ago? We're just telling ourselves that we saw something. We're thinking that we resaw what we saw 5 seconds ago, but that's just a memory, or even an impression of a memory. You're just thinking about it. So it is almost holographic and illusionist, when it's like the closer you look at it, the more it just evaporates. Like peripheral vision only. Consciousness, the movie isn't actually moving. It's a series of still images, and even that's
putting it together.
But that impression is real.
Right.
Yeah.
30 minutes. 30 seconds. So I keep doing that.
Yeah, I could definitely see a lot of similarities in our positions, but if you're going to make assumptions, you have to be able to defend them somehow, and you're not going to be able to defend them unless someone tries to pick them apart. So fair is fair.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for Thank you very much for coming on to the show and really giving us this fantastic debate. I really do appreciate both of you coming on and really just having this discussion with us. Everybody in the comment section, thank you so much for being there, giving us fantastic comments and everything like that, and questions and just interacting. This is what we love to do, is just have great comments and great discussions for you, the viewer, and just to learn new things in general. So again, thank you all for making this happen, because this would not happen if it wasn't for all of you. So again, thank you. The debate is over, sadly, but we will have future debates. So that's going to be great. So all in all, I would wish you all to have a good night, and I will see you next Saturday and Sunday on the Atheist Uprising. Until then, have a great weekend, or rest of weekend, and a great week. Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Time out.